Deep down, Mrs. Harris did not like traveling. She preferred the quiet comfort of her home to the jolt of the road and the romance of distant wanderings. This time, however, she had a very good reason for leaving her hometown. Her only son, Michael, was to be married, and the loving mother couldn't possibly miss such an event. Despite the modest wedding ceremony, the newlyweds and the guests that they had invited were rather pleased. What's more, Mrs. Harris was very fond of her son's fiancée, who bore the pleasant name of Melissa, and was head over heels enamored of her lover. Watching the newlyweds, the woman furtively wiped away a tear. The thought came to her that now she was no longer afraid to die, knowing that her son would be as strong as ever with such a spouse by his side. After spending a couple of days with the new couple, Mrs. Harris went home to a small town somewhere up in northern Maine. She didn't want to burden the young couple, and it was time for Michael to return to duty. Michael, after graduating, had enlisted in the Navy, where he served his first tour on contract and then decided to do one more stint. Deep down, Mrs. Harris was proud of her son, who had achieved everything in his life by himself. And now, when she arrived home, the first thing she did was wipe down his photograph on the bedside table. On it, Michael, smiling radiantly, was captured in the uniform of a sailor of the Pacific Fleet. Even though Mrs. Harris was tired after the long drive, her neighbor, Rebecca Jenkins, dropped by immediately. In the neighborhood, she was known as the Maine gossip girl and always prided herself on the fact that not a single piece of news passed her by. "Well, Patricia, happy with the bride?" asked Mrs. Jenkins. Mrs. Harris responded by nodding her head approvingly, expressing her affection for her son's sweetheart. Rebecca Jenkins pursed her lips resentfully and pondered. It annoyed her, frankly, that anyone other than herself could be happy. Rebecca's son, unlike Michael, did not serve in the Army and went straight out of high school into an unsuccessful business. Not only that, Steve even managed to get married and then divorced. This really upset Mrs. Jenkins, whose image as a successful woman was noticeably damaged after. "Where did Michael meet her?" the neighbor asked, looking for something to dig into. "Oh, it's quite an interesting story. Michael and Melissa met each other on the ship where he was serving. She was working as the ship's doctor," Mrs. Harris answered with warmth in her voice. "Then he married her out of despair and longing for a woman's affection. When you sail year-round, any old girl is a beauty," retorted Rebecca, who was jealous of other people's well-being. But Mrs. Harris had always been of a docile nature and was not one for squabbling, so she let her neighbor's hurtful words pass her by. Several years passed, and Michael's contract came to an end. After receiving his severance pay, the retired sailor and his wife decided to return to their home country. Mrs. Harris was the happiest of all, as it was hard for her to keep the house in good condition alone. It was an old two-story house with more than enough room for several generations of Harrises. In his hometown, Michael felt like a fish in water and almost immediately found a job at the lumber mill. And Melissa, even though she wasn't from there, got hired as a physician at the local hospital. The girl, to the delight of Mrs. Harris, was a housewife, and she spent every spare minute furnishing the house and tending to the stove. They lived their lives in harmony, and upon first sight of Michael and Melissa, it seemed clear that their marriage would be strong and long-lasting. All the time, while the happy couple settled the family nest, Rebecca Jenkins continued to insist on stopping by. Most likely, the woman just couldn't wait to stick her nose where it didn't belong and assess the neighbor's daughter-in-law the only way she knew how. Knowing this, Mrs. Harris deliberately avoided inviting the local gossip girl and tried her best to save the comfort of the relationship between the spouses. One day, though, the sly neighbor, under some plausible pretext, still managed to penetrate the house of Michael and his family. She remembered Mrs. Harris's son as a teenager and knew he was tall and good-looking. Melissa's appearance was shocking to Rebecca Jenkins, however. To say that Michael's significant other was ugly was putting it lightly. She was unattractive, short, with an unusual and unremarkable figure. On top of all that, her face had an ugly, stubby scar on it. What could they possibly have in common? Michael is so handsome, and this village girl, ugly as death, thought Mrs. Jenkins, who couldn't wait to share this hot news with all her many girlfriends. One day, when coming upon Patricia Harris in the supermarket, the sharp-tongued neighbor couldn't resist asking, "Why is Michael's fiancée so ugly? She looks like a monkey. No face, no body. Couldn't you find a better one?" Mrs. Harris looked reproachfully into Rebecca's eyes and said, "You only see the outside of a person without knowing what's inside. There are some people who aren't pretty to look at, but their souls are pure and shining from the inside. That's Melissa. Her neighbor shook her head in response and put on a smart face. Even the fact that Melissa had cured her bronchitis, which had plagued her so, especially in the wet weather, didn't change Rebecca's mind. The girl had a reputation as a competent therapist, and in her years in the Navy had acquired a good medical practice. Yet instead of gratitude, Mrs. Jenkins kept repeating around every corner that Melissa was a witch who drugged Patricia Harris and her son. How else would you explain why everyone loves and appreciates her, the ugly monkey? Rebecca insisted, trying to prove a point. But as time passed, the Harris family grew stronger by the day. The young people spent their free time fixing up the house, intending to fix its ramshackle walls and roof. One day, not far from the hospital where Melissa worked, there was a fire. The house of the Whites, an elderly couple who lived across the street, had caught fire. The fire originated in the kitchen and instantly engulfed the entire house. Melissa was one of the first people outside the burning house. With an experienced eye, she saw the owners, who had escaped the fire, standing on the front lawn wiping away their tears. They refused Melissa's offer of medical assistance, saying that their granddaughter Catherine was still inside. The girl didn't hesitate long. Soaking a scrap of cloth in a bucket of water, Melissa wrapped their heads and then rushed into the fire-ridden house. Even though Melissa was only gone for 5 minutes, witnesses to the tragedy already thought she was dead. Suddenly, where there seemed to be no hope for rescue, Melissa shot out of the burning house, carrying the little girl in her arms. The little girl, trembling across her entire body, clung tightly to her savior. Many of the people present at the fire burst into loud applause, wiping away their own tears. A couple of days later, a newspaper article was printed about the incident and Melissa's role in it, with a full-page photo of the heroine. "She's a witch for sure. Not even fire can take her out," Mrs. Jenkins said, irritated by the attention Melissa was getting. The modest girl wasn't in need of such fame, though. As if she was glad of anything, it was only that little Catherine was saved. After the girl recovered from the fire, Melissa decided to visit her and check on her health. After the accident, Catherine's grandparents had received their insurance and now, at their old age, were settling into their new place. Little Catherine, seeing her rescuer on the doorstep, happily threw herself into her arms. "Well, you see, everything went fine. Not a scar to boot, too. I know how scared you were," said Melissa as she stroked the child on the head. Much later, over a cup of tea and a bun, Melissa talked about how, as a child, she had almost become a victim of a fire that left a mark on her face. Melissa lived in California, where wildfires raged every summer. It was a dry year, and volunteers, along with the Salvation Army, were mobilized to fight the fires. As it happened, Melissa's home, where she lived with her mother and little sisters, was in the very path of the disaster, which destroyed everything it crossed. And when it seemed there was no escape, a squad of Marines arrived and helped the occupants escape from the captivity of the fire. Melissa remembered one soldier who had risked his life to carry her out of the burning house. Tragically, he had ingested too much smoke and suffered fatal carbon dioxide poisoning. As he said goodbye, the dying soldier handed Melissa a small pendant on a chain, asking her to keep it as a memento. Everything around was burning, so there was no time to talk, and Melissa and her family were evacuated from the epicenter of the fire. After that, there were rumors that the dead soldier's body was never found. The fire took him with it, leaving an unforgettable mark on Melissa's memory. Since that time, many years have passed, but the girl mentally thanked her savior every day for giving his life for the sake of her salvation. At the end of the story, Melissa took out the pendant and cried. Not a minute later, Mr. White turned pale and leaned against the wall, clutching at his heart. Melissa immediately came to and started offering him medical attention, but the old man began breathing more evenly and assured the girl that he was already feeling better. As it turned out, Mr. White had given this pendant to his son, Chris, before he joined the Marines. Melissa couldn't hold back tears when she learned that a generation later, she had returned the favor in kind. The girl rescued in the fire was the daughter of Chris's sister, who had come to visit her grandparents for the holidays. That night, Melissa, little Catherine, and the White couple stayed up late. Looking through old photographs of their son, who had left the world as a hero, Catherine thought about how everything that happens in the world is the will of God, and nothing occurs for no reason.